Good evening, and welcome to the Massachusetts Historical Society. I am Brenda Lawson. I am the interim president, and I'm delighted you've joined us this evening for a program about the consistencies and inconsistencies in family structure during the American Revolution. As those of you in the room can see, we have C-SPAN with us tonight filming this event. And I also want to welcome more than 300 of you joining us online as well. I'm also pleased to welcome some of the descendants of the brothers of the Battle of Bunker Hill, and there are several of you dispersed throughout the audience, who are in town for commemorations of the battle and who know firsthand about revolutionary kinship. At the MHS, we host a variety of events that explore the complexities of history and encourage people to share their observations, interpretations, and ideas. We are able to do so thanks to the support of friends like you. Visit our website to learn more about our programs and how you can support us. This evening, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Lisa Wilson, Dr. Karen Wulf, and Dr. Jamie Crumley. Lisa Wilson is the Charles J. McCurdy Professor Emeritus of American History at Connecticut College. Her current research focuses on the experiences of 17th century women in Barbados, Bermuda, Virginia, and New England. She has published on topics such as widowhood, manhood, and stepfamilies in early America. I will turn it over to Lisa to introduce our speakers and invite you to sit back and enjoy the program. Thank you.
Welcome. After the bicentennial, the same year in 1980, Linda Kerber published Women of the Republic, Intellect and Ideology in Revolutionary America, and Mary Beth Norton published Liberty's Daughters, The Revolutionary Experience of American Women, 1750 to 1800. Both took on the issue of women, and to some extent, the family during the American Revolution. Since these pioneering works, further research has expanded ideas about women and men and what constituted a family. All these categories during the revolutionary period morphed and changed with circumstances. Who was considered family expanded and contracted. Also, who was considered kin was malleable and connected to many factors, including race, class, and condition. War brought death, which meant families became disrupted. At the same time, families endured because they had to. The story is complex and includes both change and continuity. Now we're on the cusp of the sesquicentennial, hard to say, 150 years. Two of the scholars writing about this new expanded notion of gender, family, and kinship during the American Revolution are here today. Both apply the lens of gender and family to expand what we think we know about the nation's founding. First, I'd like to introduce Professor Jamie Crumley. Professor Crumley is an assistant professor in gender studies and ethnic studies at the University of Utah. She has a PhD in gender studies from UCLA and a Master's of Divinity from Yale University. Her manuscript in progress is titled We Will Live, Black Christian Feminists in the Age of the Revolutions. Among her publications are Where African and Indigenous Stories Meet, the Story of the Old North Church, 1723 to 1812 in Anglican and Episcopal history. She's received numerous grants, including the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium. Her presentation today is titled Negro Child Belonging to Intimate Possibilities in 18th Century Church Records. Professor Crumley.
Good evening. On October 4th, 1774, Mather Byles, who was then the minister at Boston's Anglican Old North Church, buried an infant boy called Prince. The church's records described Prince as a Negro child belonging to Ebenezer Goff. This brief entry about Prince's burial is terse. Like the other burials that are recorded on this page, this entry fails to capture the devastation that might have accompanied the death of a child who was only 15 months old. However, unlike the other burials that are recorded on this page, Prince spent his brief life in the liminal space between human and non-human, as a captive who belonged not to his parents, but to Ebenezer Goff. The phrase, Negro child belonging to, appears constantly in the archives of slavery in New England. The phrase exemplifies cultural theorist Christina Sharp's idea that slavery produced what she calls monstrous intimacies between enslaved people and their enslavers. From 1775 until 1778, the deceased boy's enslaver, Ebenezer Goff, served in the Revolutionary War as a private. The record of Goff's life after his military service is scant. Were it not for Old Norse records, his status as a man to whom a young African child belonged might be lost to history. Like Goff, who held a child he called Prince as his captive, the church that buried Prince had a complex relationship with the idea of freedom. On April 18, 1775, the church's story converged with the mythology of the American Revolution. It is believed that on that evening, 2 church members hung lanterns in the church's steeple that signaled the approach of British troops by sea across the Charles River. The church's entanglement with Revolutionary War history is unexpected for at least 2 reasons. First, because until the Protestant Episcopal Church was established in Philadelphia in 1789, Old North was a Church of England parish in a mostly Puritan town. The parish depended upon England for support. In 1730, the congregation requested that the parish receive gifts from King George II. Over the next 3 years, the king sent an array of gifts to the church. The second reason why it's surprising is because the church, like many others in 18th century Boston, never rejected the institution of slavery. Old North was a mission church and procured much of its financial support from the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which was the missionary arm of the Church of England. The society owned Codrington Plantation, which was a large sugar plantation in Barbados, where it held enslaved people whose bodies it branded with the word society so that they would be easily identifiable if they fled. Many 18th century Old North members held enslaved people in Boston, owned plantations in the Caribbean, and trafficked enslaved people throughout the Atlantic world. 18th century church records reveal the intimate, albeit fragmented, histories of African people's lives. When I call these histories intimate, I'm building upon the turn in slavery studies that, as Diana Ramey Berry and Leslie M. Harris put it in the introduction to their edited volume, Slavery and Sexuality, places sexuality at the center of slavery studies in the Americas. Sexuality is reflected in our emotional and physical practices and can involve both productive and non-reproductive expressions. It is rooted in cultural beliefs and reflects both love and oppressive power. An intimate approach to the study of slavery attempts to preserve enslaved people's humanity. From the moment they recognized that they were human captives, they primarily experienced painful and destructive forms of intimacy. However, as Black feminist slavery studies scholars have revealed, enslaved Africans also forged intimate connections with each other that helped them to survive bondage and create Afro-Atlantic countercultures. My recent work focuses on enslaved and free African peoples' creation of intimate Afro-Atlantic countercultures in 18th and 19th century New England. New England slavery studies reveals that intimacies between enslaved people and between enslaved people and their enslavers were forged in distinctive ways in New England because of the slave economy, which functioned differently in New England than it did in the South and the Caribbean. Many New England enslavers held 1 or 2 people in bondage. These enslaved people were incorporated into the household alongside servants and apprentices. Here on the screen, on the side closest to me, we can see a census of all enslaved people ages 15 and up. This was taken by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it was taken between December 1754 and January 1755. And this is just the first page of that census, but it gives us an idea of the numbers of enslaved people who lived in Massachusetts at that time. Now, of course, the data in this census is incomplete. There are blanks where assessors did not visit a town to collect data or where the information that they shared has been lost. There were also many enslaved children in Massachusetts, like Prince, who we see in 18th century Massachusetts. The church records reveal their presence, as do newspaper advertisements, like what we see on the right side of the screen. We see in a couple of different places the top advertisement, which talks about a male who is to be given away and says to inquire of the printer. And similarly, down near the bottom of the page, a fine Negro female child of excellent breed to be given away. And so these children appear constantly in the records, even if they aren't accounted for in data like censuses. Most enslaved Africans in 18th century Massachusetts, you might be able to see on this first page of the census, were in Suffolk and Essex counties. And by far the greatest number of Africans were living in Boston. So that's a little bit small. It says that there were 989 enslaved Africans in Boston in January of 1755. Disproportionately, they were male. 647 were male, 342 were female. In addition to the reality of living in households with very few other enslaved Africans, the gender imbalance forced non-traditional forms of intimacy and relationality. Plantations provided a vast geography on which enslaved people could covertly form communities, but enslaved people in cities used whatever resources the urban geography afforded to build bonds, avoid isolation, and pursue paths to liberation. During the late 18th century, many enslaved people in Massachusetts filed freedom petitions. They sowed the seeds that led to slavery being declared incompatible with the state's constitution. Although enslaved people frequently interfaced with legal systems, they knew the law alone would not save them and their families. At churches like Old North, people of color formalized their unions. While most enslaved people in the plantation South could not be legally married, legal marriages between people of color were more common in the North. So the church records allow us to see the somewhat unusual ways that intimacies developed in 18th century New England. Many New England Christians practiced what historian Catherine Gerbner has called Christian slavery. Missionary Anglicans in the Caribbean led the way in creating laws and customs that strengthened slavery while encouraging enslavers to convert their enslaved people. And the records of Old North, including this sermon that we see on the side of the page closest to me, are reflective of this tendency toward Christian slavery that existed at Old North at the time. So I need to wrap up, so I'll just say that I began this presentation by discussing an infant boy called Prince, who was buried at Old North in 1774. So I'm going to conclude with the son of a different Prince, who was a Black activist and Freemason, Prince Hall. You might have heard that name. So on May 2nd, 1784, Primus Trask Hall, who was a Revolutionary War veteran, and Phoebe Robson were married at Old North. I know that this page is pretty faded. They are the third down on the top of the page here. And the records describe them as Negroes. Like Prince Hall, who is presumed to be his father, Primus continued to live in Boston after the Revolutionary War. Because of their lifelong residency in Boston, both men experienced slavery and legal freedom in the city. It's not clear whether Phoebe Robson was ever enslaved, but we do know with certainty that she knew the uncertainty that came with being a Black person in 18th century Boston. Like other Black Bostonians, Primus Trask Hall and Phoebe Robson lived on the cusp of freedom, and they negotiated the still undefined idea of being a free Black family in the new nation. I conclude by discussing their marriage, not because it was uncommon for people of African descent to marry at 18th century Old North, but because it is surprising that the presumed son of Prince Hall chose to marry at Old North after the Revolution. The church's records contain many brief snippets that make the intimate histories of Black Bostonians visible and reveal that despite the racism within Boston's English churches, many African people found financial and spiritual support within them. The experiences of 18th century Afro-Bostonians remind us that family extends far beyond blood relations. Throughout history, our families have been the ones to whom we belong, whether by force or by choice. Thank you.
Secondly, we have Professor Karen Wulf, who is the Beatrice and Julio Mario Santo Domingo Director and Librarian at the John Carter Brown Library and the Professor of History at Brown University. She was also the former Executive Director of the Alejandro Institute of Early American History and Culture. Her new book, Genealogy, and I'm very excited about it, and it comes out next month, called Genealogy and the Power of Connection in Early America, will be published by Oxford next month. Professor Wulf was part of the founding team who launched the well-known site, Women Also Know History. She also famously coined, I'm going to quote you, the vast early America idea in 2016, which came to define the field in many ways. As she has said, vastness isn't only about space or even time. Early America is a many centuries field, but also about getting close up to people whose experiences traditional historical accounts have overlooked or subordinated. Professor Wulf is a prolific public historian as well. She's published widely and given her time to many boards and advisory councils. Her presentation today is titled Families at War.
Thank you. Thank you to the Mass Historical Society for this lovely invitation. Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction. It is so great to be in conversation with you and with Jamie and to hear about Jamie's research in particular. Like both of you, I've spent a long time thinking about families and the history of family in early America. And I'm sorry for being in a kind of reflecting mode right now, as I'm going to have this book in my hands within a couple of days. So I'm thinking a lot about what it's meant to think through the material and the research that's informed it. I've been thinking a lot about the multidimensional implications of the history of family and what it means for us to try to grapple with the history of family and the history of families. Family, of course, is an experience that is as close to universal as anything. Historians don't like to talk about universals because we like to talk about things being historically specific. And of course, we know that families are diverse and that individual experiences of family are very different. But family is an emotional experience, though not always positive. It can be stricken with violence from the inside or from the outside. It is an economic structure for sharing or for extracting resources. It is a political framework through which so much social organization is digested and filtered, and then policy is created. Thinking hard about the history of family and about families' histories is enormously important and revealing. Though we don't really do this enough, often pulled by more traditional and more frankly outdated historical frameworks, we often are pulled to think about family as purely a domestic matter, for example, of little consequence where politics or economics is where the action is. And I know every single person in this room with even a moment's reflection will know that that is not the case, that family is always quite serious business. So in the course of the research for this book that I'm so excited about, and which I can't resist continuing to do research for, as you can see here, this is my Instagram account where I just put stuff that I just like keep finding because I can't stop. I was even in the reading room this afternoon before this event. It's also just clear how profuse and diverse the evidence of family experience and thinking and structuring around family was. When we think about family in the Revolution, we can think about all the ways in which conflicts like the Revolution or previous wars or subsequent wars not only affected families, but all the ways in which family drove the dynamics of those conflicts. And here, of course, I am thinking particularly about the Revolution and British America. So, for example, we might think about Lord Dunmore's famous proclamation in 1775 in my native Virginia, which is only the most obvious inflection point for enslaved families, when Dunmore offered freedom to those who would join or remain with the Loyalists, enslaved families were making hard choices about how and whether patriots or loyalists would best advance the interests of their families. There are political divisions in families that are really prominent. We can think about Benjamin Franklin and his loyalist, royalist son, William Franklin, the governor of New Jersey. That's a kind of an obvious case that people turn to think about how families were riven by the Revolution. But we know once we start to look up close, we see this in lots of different places. I think about families in Philadelphia, for example, where Quaker families were divided between those who insisted on being neutral, those who were patriot, those who were moderate. You only have to look at a few families to see how challenging these political conflicts were. A prominent example in this case would be of what I refer to as the extended Lloyd family, because that was the progenitor, but Charles Thompson, who was the fiery patriot secretary of the Continental Congress, and his very moderate cousin, John Dickinson. They ate together, they sat together, they talked together, their wives spent a lot of time together, they negotiated, they remained together despite the fact that their political views left them in sharp disagreement. But we can also think about the many ways that families had to organize themselves to manage war, the economics of war, the deprivations of war, finding enough food to feed your family, and the place to house your family. And then lastly, the things that have occupied my mind so much about how families think about their relationship one to another, how they remembered it, how they narrated their relationship, how families remembered the Revolution as something that shaped their experience, and how they wanted their descendants to remember it too. One of the most poignant examples that I worked with is right here at the Mass Historical Society of Family and Revolution. And it's a family Bible I first studied more than 15 years ago, and I got to turn the pages again today, which was great. So this is the family Bible of Nathaniel Barber. Students of Massachusetts history and of Boston's Revolution will know that name, Nathaniel Barber. He was one of the Sons of Liberty, and his name is engraved on Paul Revere's famous Liberty Bowl that is at the MFA. He joined his fellow sons in 1773 in the, quote, destruction of the tea. In other words, he was all in as a patriot. Nathaniel Barber and his wife Elizabeth were all in other ways, too, that we can see in their family's history. They had children. Actually, he had a lot of children. He had 3 wives, and he had children across 34 years of different wives. Yeah. Anyway, in those 34 years of having many children, Nathaniel Barber and his wives' children were named for grandparents and for parents, siblings. That's pretty typical and common: William, David, Dorothy, and George. But these children were joined by little Wilkes Barber, little Oliver Cromwell Barber, and Catherine Macaulay Barber. English political figures, a radical member of Parliament, the interregnum, some would say regicide, Puritan Lord Protector, and an equally radical and equally notable woman historian. These names ensured that the little Barber's politics would endure at least in this way. And I can confirm that when Catherine Macaulay Barber was married in the 1790s, her full name, Catherine Macaulay Barber, is recorded. But the family Bible was for more than recording data, as so many family histories were. It was for holding memory. The family left Boston in the siege of May of 1775, staying with friends about 15 miles outside of the city. And Elizabeth, Nathaniel's first wife, died by July, probably in another pregnancy. Only in July of 1776 did the family return to Boston. And then it was that Nathaniel Barber wrote in this extraordinarily large, heavy, very expensive 1683 Amsterdam printed Bible. It's a beast, this thing. He wrote, quote, "Thus, by the tyranny of George III, was my family driven from their peaceful habitation, rather than submit to the cruelty of the British tyranny and his infernal officers and soldiers. My children lost their dearest friend, and I lost the wife of my youth. And 2 years later, still in the midst of war, he brought Elizabeth's remains back to Boston, to our family tomb. So when we think about family, we think about these emotional, textured, deeply poignant and meaningful moments, but we also think about the political and economic structures behind them that drive them, that encourage someone to name their children for political radicals, but that also encourage them to put lots more on the line then because they felt they could or they should or they needed to. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Thank you.
We're going to transition over to this seating area and take questions and hopefully have a conversation.
All right, I think you're ready.
Yeah, C-SPAN choreography.
There we go. Excellent.
Well, I have tons of questions, but I wonder if you all have something you'd like to ask our panelists first. Nobody has families. There's one.
What do you think gives families the courage to move on in these really difficult situations? What do you think gives families the courage to move on in these really difficult situations? Because think about it, since the founding of our country, we've been in all these difficult situations with families. You look at Ukraine every night, you look at Gaza. I mean, how do families survive? What do we learn from what we went through?
Well, I guess I'll start and just say that one thing that's clear is that it's really different depending on the kinds of resources that people have, what they have to withstand the emotional, financial, and frankly violent conditions that they face. These are really differential. I think one thing that seems interesting from the kinds of memories that people have of the revolution, and I'm interested in those Virginia families who chose to go with Lord Dunmore, who chose to go to Canada, for example, to claim their freedom, and some did and some didn't get that, or families in and around Boston, or people in Providence where I live now. All of these families who remember revolution remember what it is they wanted. And I think that's instructive for us, that whether it's clear in the moment what people want out of the situation, when they reflect on it, they think, I did that because of X. I was driven by this thing. Whether it's they were driven by politics or a particular political commitment, or they were driven by this desire to see their family succeed in a particular way, that's how they remember it later.
I think it's a difficult question to answer, and you've linked it to some contemporary political concerns around war, which I think brings some additional gravity to the question. In terms of my work, one thing that I'm finding is that, and I guess that goes back to what you were saying about resources, the institutions really can help as much as we have perhaps concerns about certain institutions like religious organizations. They do provide a sense of home for people who have lost everything. So sometimes they can be an extension of the biological family when that has been lost.
That's kind of connected to one of the things I was going to ask you all about was, what if there isn't a choice, you know? And I think about it as families of necessity. You know, when non-biological connected people become kin, and how do we trace those connections? Because I think in some crisis circumstances particularly, those bonds form. And so I was thinking about that. How does one define family? You can start with a partnership, children, economic connection. We talked about emotional connection. But I'm very interested in the kind of family of choice idea prior to the modern period, and how that was reflected. I don't know if you guys found anything in your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think godparentage shows up.
I was going to ask about that.
And a lot of the church records, not only at Old North, but at other churches around New England, we see these examples of godparents. We see examples of, Black folks who this isn't, it's really challenging, right, when we're talking about the history of slavery and indentured servitude, but the ways in which that becomes its own sort of warped, troubling family, but creates this kind of structure for people who are living on the fringes of society. We know that folks who were sailors, right, we'll see that even after the Revolution, where they're forming these organizations in the North End and elsewhere so that they can take care of each other. So I think we see these great examples of families of choice that are so critical to survival.
Yeah, I think history of family, obviously, I feel pretty passionate about how important it is and how important it is to think about family as a really essential category for historical analysis and explication. And I always find it frustrating when I read a contemporary news account of some, political policy or government policy or whatever, and I'm like, ugh, why can't we just come out with it and say, this is about ideas about how families should be, or this is specifically about families? Like, family is a really big category for how we think and act as a society. So, how we think and act and interpret families historically seems enormously important too. And one of the weird things that happens with the history of family that Lisa and Jamie both know really well is that there are kind of stereotypes about what the family looked like in centuries past. And so one of those that's really sticks, it's amazing how often you come across it, is that because infant mortality is so high, because children die so young, because actually mortality in general is very high in the period that we're studying, is that somehow families don't care about one another as much, or that parents don't care about their kids quite as much, which is like completely and utterly not true at all. Like, you could just see the devastation, the emotional devastation that people experience when they lose their loved ones, and parents for children in particular. So I think when you ask this question about how do we think about the nature of family in this period, my mind turns to some of those kinds of stereotypical views. People didn't care about their families as much because people died all the time and they kind of got used to it. They did not. Or that family was like extended, always like family was, big, and there were, was always like this big extended family and multiple generations always living together, and then it changed to this nuclear style family somehow at the late 18th century. That's not really true either, and demographers have shown us that. And then the last is that this idea that somehow in the 20th century, and Lisa's work shows this directly, in the 20th century it's step parentage or step families or half siblings or so on is like a modern phenomenon. And it's all over the 18th century. People have families that are complex and blended and made of people who are biological and non-biological relations all the time. I talked about Nathaniel Barber's multiple, I shouldn't have been so snide about his multiple wives. It's not it's just I'm kind of astonished that, he was rather older when he married a lovely woman who died young, and then he married her much younger sister, and then had many children with the much younger sister. Anyway, but those kids are related in one way, right, to the children of his little Oliver Cromwell and Catherine Macaulay. So these relationships are powerful and important, and you see people talking about those relationships in their correspondence and in their diaries and in their family memories and in the way they think about one another.
Thanks. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to the intersection of family and economics. And I'm thinking in particular about how family is held as this value, and yet the minute it intersects with economic interests, children being taken away from their parents and put into a poorhouse, for example, or the way black families were treated differently than white families because of the property value there. I'm wondering if you could kind of tease out a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I hope I understand the question correctly. So in terms of enslaved families, I mean, I think it's really difficult to have a conversation about enslaved families, in part, you know, I think in some ways, especially in New England, because of this crisis of family separation, which I think you're alluding to a bit in your question. And it always just appalls me when I'm looking through the records of the newspapers from 18th century Massachusetts and seeing all of these records of children who were simply given away. Whereas we know that in the South and in the Caribbean, there was a lot of interest in the future potential of those children. And so I think New England provides this really fascinating case study to see this real devaluation, especially of Black childhood. You know, free Black children, of course, were often put into indentures if their families, you know, if members of their families died who were supposed to be supporting them, or if their families simply could not support them. But yeah, I think it's difficult to talk about the idea of the Black family apart from this capitalism and Atlantic world capitalism, and specifically the way that the slave economy was functioning in 18th century New England.
Yeah, I think that's such an important dynamic for us to talk about and confront. You know, Thomas Jefferson was a complicated guy, but in so many ways he was so like others of his 18th century Virginia contemporaries. Thomas Jefferson's family, like so many families, like every founding father that you could find, was quite interested in genealogy, and they kept family records. And you know, there is a special place where Thomas Jefferson continues his mother's work in recording their family history. But he keeps the record of his children with Sally Hemings, with whom by many accounts he had quite close relationships with, in some ways differently close than his relationship with his children by his wife, who was Sally Hemings' half-sister. But he keeps the record of those children's births in something called the Farm Book, where he also lists horses and cows and what he's doing with acreage. So I feel that you know, Jefferson is an exemplar in so many ways. He has the power to illuminate for us the meaning of freedom and a society in which all persons are created equal, and yet at the same time, he so starkly differentiates his own children on the basis of the enslaved condition of their mother. So I don't know what that says, other than that it's hard to find clarity around that issue, and it's hard to reconcile how he may have felt about Sally Hemings or their children. Annette Gordon-Reed, the great historian, remarkable historian, and the greatest historian of Jefferson in my view, says that, you know, maybe Jefferson and Hemings had some kind of a committed relationship. She wants to say that that's a possibility. And partly she asks us to think that we should hold these things in one place, that there could be that violence and that hypocrisy, and maybe also affection in the same place. It's pretty horrifying, but maybe it's true.
I serve as a member of the New Hampshire House of Representatives, and I was not ever lost that when I ran for office, this would have an effect on my wife. In the last 72 hours, we've had discussions due to political assassinations in the Midwest that we're all still trying to figure out. Looking back at the colonial era, Abigail Adams extensively wrote about the effect on her life having her husband not only do things within Massachusetts, but going to Europe and the fact that he was just gone. In your research, have you discovered other wives of early politicians that have written, because we hear about her a lot, but she couldn't have been the only one. So there had to have been others that were making documentation about what they were going through. And is that something that should be brought to light as well, and not just from the constant reference to Abigail Adams?
First of all, thank you for your service, and I know that, I don't think that I haven't encountered a single person in the last 36 hours who doesn't think about our elected representatives and how fragile our democracy is, but how important elected representatives are. But I'm sure, we also all know that politics is a family business, and it always was. So we don't even have to go to the Revolution or to Abigail Adams. We can look at the colonial governors and how their families were involved in colonial government. We can look at, we could look at George III. Queen Charlotte was really important to his government. So politics has always been a family business, and it has always required the full family's participation. There are historians who've done really remarkable work in helping us to see women and prominent women's roles in prominent politics. For example, Catherine Allgore here, who was here at the MHS, who wrote a wonderful book called Popular Politics about how women created the culture of politics in early Washington, D.C. And it's a great book because it shows us not just that politics is about domestic life. She's not just saying like women took care of the domestic stuff so the guys could do the other stuff, but she showed how women really created the space for conversation, controversy, working things out that was really necessary during some really heated political times. So yeah, the short answer is yes.
Thank you both for your research and your presentations today. My question is about public history, because we often think about the family being private, and I know you mentioned Old North Church as part of your presentation. What other ways does public history show up in your research, and what has been your experience of immersing yourself in family public history?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm curious to see what you have to say about this too, Karen. I got the pleasure of doing a one-year fellowship with the Old North Church after I finished my doctoral program, and was just amazed by the opportunity to see the records, which are held here at the MHS, so others should also come and look at them, but also by the Old North Church's records are really fascinating because it's an Anglican church, and there's a lot of holding back in the records. We don't necessarily see as much of the if you look through some of the Puritan church records where people are sharing testimonies of faith and all of that. And I know that there are some other churches throughout New England who have done really excellent work with kind of preserving some of the testimonies of faith of some of the African descendant parishioners and indigenous parishioners. And those sorts of records just don't exist at Old North because that practice of doing confessions of faith was not so prominent. But yeah, I think the public history dimension is incredible, and I think especially in this political moment, which we've seen, so much pushback against the work that historians do over the past several years, right? But especially right now, I think public history sites are really on the front lines of being able to educate the public, but also being able to really infuse that human dimension, which can sometimes be missing, right, in other forms of history that we encounter. But yeah, I'm really excited to see that there are other, I think especially as a person who's, delved a little bit into church history, some religious organizations who are really taking seriously the work of uncovering their past, because that past is so personal, especially in a lot of churches. You get a lot of opportunity to really see these really personal histories and these ways that people built connections. Yeah, so I'll just stop there, but thank you for the question.
Yeah, indeed, that's a great question. I think about that, I guess, in two dimensions. One is that it has been, public history sites have been typically better at preserving kind of family histories, and in many ways, the preservation of family memory and family materials has been stronger at public history sites, and I think that might be why public history sites have been so proactively successful at exploring the complex dimensions of, I think about the Royal House here, of course I've just mentioned Jefferson, so I'm thinking about Monticello, but exploring not just the story of the white owners of the house, but all the people who lived in houses and being able to interpret the full story of those spaces. But the other thing I think about is that because I've written a history of genealogy in the 18th century and how people in the 18th century are doing genealogical work, I get to interact with genealogists a lot, which is the publicist of public history. Genealogy is the most active historical community in the United States. And that's really interesting because for me, it takes me into lots of different kinds of conversations. And I appreciate it a lot, and I learn a lot.
And to go from public history to the classroom, how would any of you, Lisa too, bring looking at families into your teaching?
Reading Cassandra Brown on George Washington. Cassie. On George Washington. I thought that it's brilliant because it brings you through the stories we know, but it weaves in the enslaved families that are having to cope with. I was going to ask you guys about inheritance, how this is so important for women's lives, but it also divides enslaved families, often in horrific ways. And I think that's one of the best versions I've ever read of kind of putting them together. So in other words, and it's not going to be now our lecture on women or now our lecture on family, but to have them intertwined, I think is the ultimate goal for me. But I defer to you too.
Well, I teach in Utah, and so this Revolutionary War history is a little, predates the state a little bit, but it is a state where folks are thinking so much about family. The LDS Church is one thing they do very well is preserve the histories of families. And so I feel like it often becomes part of what we do in the classroom, talking about families, looking at primary sources together. I always find that that's the best tool for students, to get them off of their computers for a couple of hours and get them into a special collections and really get to delve into these stories for themselves and to really think about the ways, and I think this comes back to what you were saying about just when we think about the history of family, we're thinking about the history of us. So thinking about ways to see their own families and their own stories reflected in the stories that they're finding, not to make the history too presentist, right? We need to, of course, remember this is its own historical moment, but really just as a way to remind them that history is about humans, right? And about the ways that humans have existed throughout time.
Yeah, one of the best teaching experiences I have had is when I was teaching undergraduates some years ago, when I was still at William & Mary, and I taught a history of family freshman seminar a couple of times, and it was great in that much of what the students did was to pick a project about their own family and to explore it. And we would do a lot of setup ahead of time. You know, no one is required to do a history of their own family because that can be really tender and tough stuff. You could pick a different family to explore. I had lots of options. But those classes and those research experiences, I think, were so fantastic. I have been thinking about, you know, those things, those photo mosaics. I know this is a tiny tangent here, but you know, photo mosaics, those things you see that it's a picture of somebody, but it's made up of a billion different little pictures. I always think about Taylor Swift because I've seen a million of these with Taylor. It's like a million pictures of Taylor looking like Taylor. Anyway, but the photo mosaic, if you zoom in, right, you can see how each individual picture looks really different. But the whole strategy there, right, is to take all these little different pictures and make them look like something that you've already preconceived, in this case, Taylor. Family history blows that apart because what it shows you is that rather than starting with the picture you think you knew, if you start close up, all of a sudden it doesn't fit. There's so many things about family histories that will not fit the narratives that we regularly learn. I'm thinking about a student, I don't want to say too much because it would be, anyway, but I'm thinking about a student who was in one of my seminars who did some work on one of her families who was involved in redlining in Norfolk, Virginia. And it was a shocking experience for this student, a really challenging experience, but also ultimately a really positive experience because it was not the narrative that this student had, either about the city where she grew up or about the family that she'd grown up in. So I think when we start with family and we encourage people to think about family, it encourages us sometimes to really challenge some of those bigger narratives that we may have forced family stories into.
I was taken by your use of the word intimate and intimacies as it relates to history. I've never heard that reference, that word used in relation, particularly to American history. So I just love to hear how you got on that trail because it's really profound.
So yeah, so I think and I know you recently wrote a book review of a Jessica Marie Johnson book, and I think she does this so well. I think there's a lot of Black feminist slavery studies scholars in particular who are doing just such excellent work in terms of thinking about, I think, this tension that Karen was talking about that I wrote down when you were talking about Thomas Jefferson, right? And the violence and the compassion, how do those coexist next to each other? Mm-hmm. And the study of whatever we might think of as family for enslaved people, I think requires us to always think about that violence and compassion next to each other, even in relations between two enslaved people. We can't be sure that there wasn't coercion there to make that happen. And of course, they are living lives that are so defined by violence. Thinking, outside of the Revolution, for example, about the story of Margaret Garner, which is something that when I teach Black women's history, it's a story that, comes up again and again. Margaret Garner, an enslaved woman who left home with her husband and with her in-laws and with her children. And you all might know the story of how she famously decided to kill her youngest child rather than continue on in slavery, and was very clear with her husband before she died that he should not remarry or have children so long as he remained in slavery. And there's something really deeply intimate and personal about that, about the ways that politics was entering her intimate life and was shaping every aspect of her life. And I think that that's that kind of framework of intimacy, and how intimacy can be really violent, but intimacy can also be really beautiful, and those things can coexist alongside each other, is something that I think in particular that slavery studies really challenges us to think about.
Yes, I have to think in teaching, sort of talking about how the students tend to be presentist, they read themselves back and they say, I'm just like that, or no. And one of the ways you can say that you're not is this coexisted in someone's brain, and could that coexist in your brain? And So you don't know them, so let's try to study them, with more distance. And so I think it's a way to get at how different things were. So I think it's important.
The past few years that we've been celebrating the turning point of the revolution, it's very easy for when everybody supported revolution. I think we have to constantly remind ourselves they didn't know how the story would turn out. And within families, each person would make a decision. It's very careful. I was park ranger. We talk about people make a decision based on what they know at the time they make the decision, what is best at this moment. People, that's selfish. No, that's common sense. Why would you make a decision that would hurt you? But there are a multitude of decisions. There could be political reasons you support one side. It could be economic. It could be religious. For black enslaved people, if your owner was Anglican, you're probably going to go to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Pack warm clothes. You don't have a choice. But other black men could choose to fight with the Continental Army in the hopes of freedom. I think we have to constantly remind ourselves there are a multitude of possible decisions everyone could have made, not knowing how the story would turn out.
That's such a great point that for our historical actors and for us too, history is a cumulative thing. Like you start with the thing you're interested in, and then you realize like the revolution is not the revolution. The revolution is everything that had come before, and that's true for those individuals and those families. But it is also true for us as we think about it. We have to think about it as that moment is the accumulation of what had come before and how they understood. And that's what we're living through too, right? Like our moment is an accumulation of what's come before and how well we understand it. Not that we needed to sell the importance of history to this group, I think.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, in the back.
Thank you for being here. You talked about families being universal. I think everyone in here has a pretty good concept of family in their heads. You all have a very deep understanding with all this work you've done and the knowledge that you have. What would you say was your biggest aha sort of moment, like your gut visceral thing, everything you know about family? Maybe it was how different something was, or maybe how similar.
I can tell you a little bit about Barbados, if you'd like to hear. There's a very famous account from the 17th century talking about the community there. And one of the things that I've been seeing is these fictive families a lot. And saying that everybody here is so close, they call each other brother, sister. And I thought, that's it. They're literally brothers and sisters. There are just so few people there in kind of what you would consider a typical nuclear family. It's mostly males. There's a high death rate. And they create new connections. And that was my aha moment, reading that, thinking, there they are. That's what I thought was there,
I mean, I guess related to that, when I think about the history of slavery in Boston, of course, it's so intimately connected with what's going on in Barbados. And we see folks, who live in Barbados who are donating to Old North for, various reasons. And it's just so fascinating sometimes to look through the records in Barbados and see some of these same names coming up as like mulatto children years down the line. And so just seeing some of these names that occur in Boston or Barbados are connected to between the two, and then seeing what clearly is a history of intimacy, right? Whether coerced or chosen. Or some combination of the two showing up literally in the naming practices of children who are not the same ethnicity as the original person I saw with that name is always really, really interesting.
Yeah.
So I've had many of those moments. I'll just briefly mention one of them, which has to do with George Washington. And most of this book is not about wealthy and powerful people like George Washington. Most of it is about people who are struggling to define themselves and define their family relationships in ways that are mutually beneficial. But I had that bizarre experience of a kind of George Washington discovery, which we don't have that really, because Washington's pretty well known and his archive is pretty well known. But in his extraordinary papers at the Library of Congress, these enormous red volumes that were bound in the early 20th century of his papers, is this single piece of paper that kind of blew my mind. I had just seen Ron Chernow's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography where he said this really kind of sly thing about how, in the first chapter, opening sentence of the book, George Washington was way too busy to care about his family history. Even though I, Ron Chernow, am not going to tell you about it. But this object was a family tree that George Washington wrote when he was a teenager. And on the other side of it is a list of enslaved people that he wrote about 5 years later. And what that shows you is that Washington was really attentive to his family relationships. He surely loved these people. He loved his brother. But also his family relationships were about property and inheritance. And there was nothing that demonstrated that more powerfully than that list on the other side. And the fact that 4 decades later he had labeled that slight piece of paper, Genealogy of the Washington Family in Virginia, and folded it carefully so it could be in his study at Mount Vernon.
Oh, hello. There we go. Can you hear me? Okay. Can we give a round of applause to our wonderful panelists, please? You all make me so happy to be able to say that we collect family history at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and that's our real strength. So it's very validating to hear all of that. So I just want to say thank you, Lisa, Karen, and Jamie, for a wonderful discussion, and thank you to those of you here in person and online for tuning in. And we invite you to join us again on Tuesday, June 24th, which is next week, for a program with Kelly Carter Jackson on her newest book, We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance. And so before I just say thank you and have a good night, I'm just going to ask if you could bring your conversations out toward the lobby so that our friends here can start to pick up their equipment and not have all of us in their way. So let's give our panelists one more round of applause, and thank you.